Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alexis Morgan, and I am WWF's Global Water Stewardship Lead. I'm also our lead at an interim basis for the apparel and textile sector work that we engage in. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you today, and I'll be speaking on the topic of risk to resilience, how the apparel and textile sector can respond to growing challenges on climate and water. Now, if you look at the planet from afar, it's really a blue sphere. We are a planet of water, and in fact, it's a fixed amount of water that's been here since the time of the dinosaurs. But what's interesting about that water is that it constantly is shifting. It varies in space and time all of the time. We are also a planet that is really entered into the Anthropocene of late, and we are a planet and a species that is really formed of water. It's critical to not only our economies, but to our well-being as a whole. And what we need to know is that the challenges that our planet faces and that people face are growing. By 2050, we're going to have a population of well over 8 billion people, and 50% of that population is projected to face high levels of water. We're also seeing the impact on freshwater throughout our planetary systems. And indeed, freshwater species are perhaps more affected by humans' changes to our planet than any other group. We've seen declines of some 84% over the course of the past 50 years at this point. And they are the proverbial canary in the coal mine. Our freshwater species are telling us that systems are really out of balance. And indeed, climate change is only likely to further accelerate some of these different trends. Now, when it comes to water in the apparel sector, it's really a question of kind of why are we even discussing this, and why does water even matter? Well, for the apparel and textile sector, it really is a thirsty business. Water touches many different parts of the value chain, ranging from right at the very beginning in the raw material production stages, all the way through from processing, manufacturing, all the way right to the very end. And indeed, it actually is quite central to many of the logistics even of moving things around, whether that's moving things in barges or various other means. But in particular, there are two sections of the value chain where water has a distinct and significant impact. Those two areas are around the raw material side of things and the wet processing and tanneries. So those two pieces in particular are quite critical. And indeed, some estimates out there suggest that in fact, the apparel and textile sector really represents about 20% of global wastewater. And so it's not only about the consumption of water, but it's also about the discharges that are associated with the apparel and textile sector that we need to be thinking about. Now, if you break down kind of, if we're looking specifically in terms of the materials and the raw processing side of things, you can get a kind of a breakdown of what this looks like. And this information, which is the most recent information from Textile Exchange, shows you not only what the makeup of different raw materials is, but how much of these is considered to be sort of more sustainable, as they've referred to as sort of, whether that's preferred cotton sources like BCI and organic, or some of the other things in terms of the man-made cellulosics that are the things like Forest Stewardship Council certified. And so when we combine all of those different sustainable components, we're looking at roughly 15 to 17% of the supply chain, or I should say the fiber production that is, let's call it sort of roughly sustainable, and therefore will be taking account for water issues in much of it. But that sort of explains why water somewhat matters, but why really, on more deeply, do we need to be paying attention to not only how water is being used in the operations and in the value chain, but the water outside of the value chains? Why does that begin to matter? Well, the simple answer to this is really about risk. This is fundamentally all about risk to your income statement, your balance sheet, and ultimately to shareholders. From a corporate perspective, there are physical risks, reputational risks, and regulatory risks that have the potential to really impact everything from operations to sales to capital infrastructure costs. And so we need to think about these and break them down. when we're talking about physical risk, we're talking about things that traditionally people think of. So, notions of water scarcity, perhaps flooding, and these other issues that I mentioned before around pollution. But there's also this component of ecosystems that are actually quite critical to regulating and managing and mitigating risks at a larger scale. There's also the reputational aspect of this. These are sorts of, the negative media press that can come and the impact that has on staff, on customers, on operating facilities and license to grow, license to operate. And lastly, there's the regulatory component when all of a sudden there are shifts that require zero liquid discharge of operations. These sorts of things can have significant, unexpected financial impacts on a company. And if we break that down a little bit more, we need to begin to look at these issues in terms of, what is actually being reported out there. Well, the latest information from CDP Water suggests that these are the issues that are most commonly reported out there. So that's everything from water stress, flooding, water scarcity, drought, these issues that I was mentioning previously. And what's important in all of this is how that begins to translate. This is not just an issue of price. In other words, it's not that we need to think about water as it's going to be more expensive to procure water in the future. Nor is it just a matter of, well, this is also perhaps going to add to costs in terms of water treatment and other things. This is really a question of values. So we need to think of it more broadly. This isn't just in terms of, higher operating costs, but it's about production disruptions. It's about cost and damage to infrastructure. And it's also fundamentally tied to notions of how sales can be interrupted. And we've seen some of these kinds of examples more recently as we've seen the impacts of COVID. And sales have gone up or down in different places depending upon whether or not people have turned to certain brands during this period and moved towards purchasing from those brands because they like those brands, they think of those brands. And so these issues that tie to how good of an actor you are critical to actually thinking about the value proposition that you're making to customers going forward. So water has the potential, and indeed many sustainability issues have the issue of connecting through to the value sets that people have. And if you can speak to those things and show how you're actually taking action around these, not only does it have benefits around saving costs and making sure that you have, uninterrupted supply chains, but it also becomes a value creator for sales, for marketing, and for other pieces. Now, if we look about these sorts of things going forward, the projections in terms of water risk, tend to be that they are likely to grow. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has been talking a lot about these challenges, not only around carbon transition risks, but the physical impacts of climate change. And indeed, if we talk about water, often we talk in terms of water being the teeth. If climate change is the shark, then water is its teeth. It is the first line of how climate change tends to manifest in these things like flooding and droughts and so forth. And so we can begin to look at different scenarios. And indeed, we have been looking at these sorts of things through various tools like the water risk filter, which is something that I'll speak a little bit more about later. So with all of these different challenges, the question is, how do we move forward? What is our pathway towards creating resilience in our supply chains and making sure that there's clean water for all, not only people, but species as well? Now, before I go too much further, I guess there may be a question in the back of some of your minds, which is, what on earth is this individual up here who works for an organization on conservation talking to us about textiles? And so, why is WWF, as the world's largest NGO, conservation NGO, working on this topic? And what do we do specifically? Well, what WWF is focused on in this space is not only these issues of freshwater, but obviously biodiversity. We work as well on climate, and all of that is tied fundamentally to making sure that we're creating well-being for people and planet. And so those are the issues that really matter to us. But in order for us to actually get at those issues, we need to be working with the players that are affecting each of those things. And so WWF has identified that the apparel and textile sector is one of these key sectors to actually making sure that we can deliver freshwater biodiversity, climate goals and impacts. And so what we do is really partner with some of the leading brands in the world and all the way through the value chain, frankly, to think about how do we drive the following pieces. Preferred sourcing, so again, on these raw materials, fibers, and so forth. Secondly, on processing and manufacturing, which, as I mentioned, is largely on this wet processing piece. And then thirdly, thinking about how do we mobilize brands, including WWF's brand in the mix of all of this. More specifically, when we're working with partners, we do an array of different things. And this is not only in our work directly with partners, but also kind of around that. So we issue reports such as a sustainable cotton ranking report. We work more specifically with companies to actually support them in their strategy development for freshwater, for climate and energy. We work with them to kind of understand the landscape of different standards and best management practices. We engage in training at the regional level. We work with national textile authorities. We're also increasingly getting into the space of supporting the delivery of finance as well, and supporting investments into cleaner technology or cleaner production technologies, and so forth. And you can see some of the other pieces there all the way through, and I'll touch upon a few of these as I go through the rest of the presentation. But if there's sort of something that we've learned over the time that we've worked with many partners when it comes to sort of building resilience in supply chain, these are some of the kind of key lessons that have really, I guess, come out of a lot of experience on the ground, in the boardrooms, and so forth when it comes to these challenges. So I'm going to walk you through each of these different 6 pieces. The first of these is that really water stewardship is at the heart of climate resilience. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but fundamentally climate is water. It is right on the forefront of this, and it is where the largest impacts are likely to be felt, certainly in the short term when it comes to climate change. Now, we talk a lot about water stewardship, and so this term may not be familiar to all of you. And so I wanted to provide a bit of a definition, and we use the definition from the Alliance for Water Stewardship, which is the use of the water that is socially equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically beneficial. And what's critical here is that it's this second part, achieved through a stakeholder inclusive process that involves site and catchment-based actions, which means this is not just about managing your water in your operation, but it's understanding that your operation, whether we're talking about a store, whether we're talking about a processing facility, you need to look around that. Who else is using water that you can impact and that impacts you? So who are you dependent upon in the basin or the catchment or the watershed that you're operating within? And so that's a really critical piece at the heart of this, because you're not going to create resilience on your own. Resilience is something that is shared with those around you in the basin. And so it's critical to have this understanding of what's surrounding any given part of your value chain, because that's where your resilience is going to come from. Secondly, you need to fundamentally understand your supply chain and its context. And this is a little bit linked to the first one, but the question of where do you focus and what do you focus on is essential in all of this. Because you can look at your entire value chain and focus in different parts to think about resilience, but you need to understand where is climate going to be felt. And as I mentioned, a lot of the time that's water. So you need to understand where are different kinds of water impacts going to be felt. And similarly, it's not just about how water can affect your business, but also how is your business affecting water. So understanding these areas that are high water use, like your fiber supply chain, like your wet processing, are actually really, really important. And so we've been working with partners. One example is working with H&M. Now, the map on there is not of H&M supply chain, it's of different global mine locations, but we can look at value chains right from any given material, whether it's fiber or other materials like metals, understand where those are coming from, and then understand the underlying risk issues that are in play in those locations. Is it scarcity? Is it something else? And then begin to think about how, as a brand, can we support our value chains to set the right kinds of targets in the right places, or support them with training and other programs, awareness programs, or even potentially help to mobilize capital to drive investments in parts of the value chain. So where you're focusing and what you're focusing on really matters. Thirdly, it's really important that we think about resilience as not just a risk management issue. This is fundamentally about opportunity and purpose. There's a lot of work that's been done in recent years talking about the shifting landscape. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier when I was speaking, but going forward, many different, not only customers, but workers are being driven by this notion of purpose. When we think of companies like Patagonia or Unilever or Tesla, these are some of the brands that are perceived as being really leading the change in front of us when it comes to sustainability of the future. They are developing products and services that are actually helping to solve the problem. They're advocating at the governance levels to improve how we're tackling climate, how we're tackling water issues. As an example, Patagonia did a campaign talking about the need to create connectivity and tear down dams to bring back river systems. And those sorts of advocacy pieces really matter. They change people's perception. And they're critical when it comes to thinking about not only talent retention and attraction, but these issues, as I mentioned before, on differentiating, your products and services, creating a more sustainable supply chain is something that you can actually begin to use in sales. And also thinking about these issues of customer loyalty. Fourthly, to create really deep resilience, we're going to need nature. Nature is a hugely valuable ally in all of this, and we've heard a lot recently around nature-based solutions. And these are really important at the end of the day. Nature has the ability to help buffer the system. And in many regards, one of the biggest problems is that we've removed nature as our buffer. Wetlands are a fantastic example of how this works, and wetlands have this ability to actually clean our water. They hold back water in times of flooding. They actually release water slowly in times of drought. So they're actually really important shock absorbers in the system. And there's been great examples of where these are being brought back. The Sponge Cities initiative within China is a really fantastic example of how we can begin to use nature in this sort of a way. And really rebuild wetlands so that they actually provide these services to us. So those sorts of landscape level efforts are really quite critical. You're not going to just, turn your factory into a wetland, but rather around the wetland and the basin, at the basin level, we need to think about resilience and how nature can be mobilized to assist. Fifthly, they really need investment. Resilient supply chains they're not going to get there on their own. These are small and medium-sized enterprises a lot of the time, and it's important that we move them towards cleaner production. What's great about this is that in many cases, cleaner production is bankable. It will create a return on investment. And so, you can attract investors to these kinds of issues and actually begin to engage them. Now, this isn't all about mobilizing capital, but it's also about training, it's about investment, it's about sharing technologies, it's about strengthening the supply chain. And there's many ways that the supply chain can be supported in that regard. WWF has been working on these sorts of issues with various companies, again, at the global level, PVH and IKEA being two examples, where we're working to do engagement in training suppliers. We're working in factories to actually help mobilize investment and therefore strengthen not only capacity at the local level, but also technologies, and share those technologies and get investors actually putting money into those technologies. Finally, it's important that we think about sectoral collaboration. This is critical to our shared success. Recently, WWF launched an open letter with a number of allies, and it's been really exciting to see the growth and buy-in on this. This open letter was really mobilized as a response to making sure that as we think about managing through this crisis that we're currently facing with COVID, that we're maintaining an ongoing focus on sustainability and building back better and all of that. And so we launched this back in August. It's been great to see an ongoing support for this. We've recently had more signatories come to the plate, like Crystal International and others here in Asia, and it's great to see this kind of ongoing momentum. And this sectoral collaboration is something that's really, really important in the apparel sector. And there's been some really great work and foundations laid by different entities, whether that's the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, ZDHC, or the Textile Exchange. There are a number of different players who are helping to kind of bind the sector together and creating shared success. And that's going to be absolutely critical as we go forward. So what does the future hold? I don't hold the crystal ball on this. What I can say is that we've learned a number of different lessons, and these different lessons are going to be really, really helpful as we go forward thinking about how to address climate change and the impacts that are going to be coming and how they're going to be hitting us as largely on this front of water. We can embrace stewardship. We need to understand our supply chains, respond not just through risk mitigation, but opportunity, understand that resilience is fundamentally tied to nature and landscapes, thinking about how we can invest in our supply chains, and ultimately collaborate with others, because that's the only way we're going to get there. So with that, I'd like to end things off with a short video clip, and from there, I'm happy to take some questions. So enjoy.
Suppose now shush, she makes the sound she makes to calm me down.
And with that, I'd like to say thank you and have a wonderful day.
네, 의류 섬유 기업들이 책임감 갖고 가치 사슬을 회복하기 위해서 어떻게 협력하고 대응하는지, 어떤 책임감을 갖고 있는지에 대해서 알 수 있었는데요. 자, 지금 드리는 몇 가지 질문들을 통해서 수전의 중요성과 또 현재 얼마나 많은 기업들이 책임감을 갖고 대응하고 있는지에 대해서 알아보도록 하겠습니다. 네, 의류 기업의 환경적 회복을 위한 노력과 협조는 잘 이어지고 있는지도 궁금합니다.
So to answer this first question, yes. I mean, the quick answer is absolutely. I think the textile sector is a really good example of sectoral collaboration. I mentioned a number of examples where there are these bodies that work in collaboration with not only with one another, but across different parts of the value chain, whether that is Textile Exchange covering some of the raw material pieces or Sustainable Apparel Coalition, their collaboration and efforts with HIGCO and pulling together information, and increasingly more and more of those sorts of efforts where pieces all link together and there is this collaboration. So I think from a sectoral perspective, absolutely the textile sector does cooperate quite well. In terms of kind of thinking about examples of good practices, I mean, I think some of the examples where we've been working in places like Turkey as an example, or perhaps even in places like China and Vietnam, where I would say there are good examples, it's really around collaboration. I think the collaborative aspect of building resilience and working together is really fundamental to how this is proceeding. And so, for example, in Taihu in China, we've been working there to develop approaches in the apparel sector that are based at the industrial park level. And there's been a lot of collaboration, not only sharing of best technologies and learning in terms of water stewardship practices, but also implementation of capital projects projects and so forth. In places like Turkey, we've been working with, again, other parts of value chains and seeing brands also collaborate for those value chains. And there we've been working on implementing better cotton and strong practices on ground there to enhance resilience of growers on the ground. So that's a couple of examples of where we've been working.
네, 혹시 물을 대체할 수 있는 재료에 대해서 생각해 보신 적이 있나요?
And the long story short is sometimes, the quick answer is water is not typically something that's easily substitutable in a number of different circumstances. But what we do see really good examples of is where people are working water out of processes entirely. And so there's really good case examples at this point of dry, basically waterless technologies for dyeing in particular. And we've seen real renaissance in that area over the last number of years. There's some really great new approaches that are being adopted in that space by not only big brands, but also sort of smaller startup brands. And so the cleaner production technology space is really embracing the challenges of reducing the dependence upon water. And I think that's going to be a critical piece going forward.
환경을 위협하는 분야가 굉장히 많을 텐데요. 특별히 의류 산업계에 관심을 갖게 된 이유가 있을까요?
Yes, at the end of the day, cotton is fundamentally, it's a thirsty crop. It's a large crop on a global basis. It's critical as a cash input for local communities, but it's one of the world's largest crops at the end of the day. And if we look at water, 90% of water is consumed in agricultural products, and cotton is a significant player in that space. And agriculture is also quite critical in terms of addressing kind of landscape pollution issues, whether that's nutrients, pesticides, those sorts of things. So from a freshwater perspective, agriculture is critical and cotton is a key commodity within that landscape. We also have this secondary challenge when it comes to the apparel and textile sector of wet processing. And, one need not go further than, going outside the shops of some of these different facilities that are discharging chromium and other dyes and other factors like that to see the impacts that it can have on not only species but local people as well. And so those kinds of issues really drove us to engage in the apparel and textile sector, and we've been engaged across a number of different geographies, both in terms of raw materials, but also these wet processing sites to make sure that we're tackling the issues of chromium and leather or other aspects in places like Vietnam, China, Pakistan, India, and so forth. So yeah, I think the pieces tied to that are really critical to making sure that we're improving not only freshwater biodiversity that exists in these areas, but also the communities that inhabit them as well. And the apparel and textile sector has been a really great ally to, face up to this challenge and really begin to take steps to address it.
네, 물은 인간의 생명을 유지시켜줄 뿐만 아니라 지구의 모든 생물들이 존재하고 번성하는 아주 중요한 요소입니다. 우리가 너무 잘 알고 있겠지만 그 중요성에 대해서는 간과하고 있었던 게 아닌가 반성해 봅니다.